All right, I want to finish this, the Antebellum Reformers up here. We left off, finished talking about transcendentalism and the utopian societies. That's going to take us into a couple other social reform areas. All right, the first one being the penitentiary reform. Dorothea Dix, very important reformer. She's going to begin working in an insane asylum and a jail, and what she finds when she's working there is that they throw everybody in there. They combine everybody together. All right, there's asylums for criminals and mentally ill. The antiquated jails need to be replaced, she says, with new penitentiaries. And what she does is she starts to divide up the prison system. She reorganizes the whole prison system into mental institutions, jailing debtors and paupers, and she kind of like breaks it down into maximum security, minimum security, sort of in that setup where, you know, the minor criminals like the debtors and the paupers and the poor, they don't need to be in the same prison. The reformer she reforms and rehabilitates the inmates instead of using rigid discipline to curb criminal laxness. She would then begin to start using solitary confinement to contemplate crimes. And her whole idea is that a properly structured institution is needed to prevent the moral failure of the individual and to rescue people from failure, and therefore hopefully it will decrease on the amount of orphanages, almshouses for the poor, and like the settlement houses for women. So she sets out, she does this, she finds the first one, or creates the first one in 1821 in Auburn, New York. All right, there's her asylum, so to speak. All right, another movement is the temperance movement. Okay, temperance, again referring to alcohol. The whole idea here is that alcohol is seen as being responsible for the crime and disorder and poverty. Large problem in the West, you know, where the farmers make extra grain into whiskey or moonshine, and then in the East, in the cities, alcohol is used as a leisure activity. So the earlier temperance movements are revived by new reformers. In 1826, you have the American Temperance Society, you know, created by Francis Willard. 1840, you have the Western Temperance Society. You know, there will be a growth of alcohol that lead to factions in the temperance movement. Some are looking to ban alcohol altogether, and some are just looking to try to reform the mind and reduce the amount of alcohol intake. And you see the Beecher family, very important temperance movement as well. All right, but again, alcohol consumption is on the rise in the 1820s, and think about it, there's a recession in 1819, which leads to depression, unemployment. How do people handle hard times like that? They drink, or they find some type of outlet. Okay, and again, this is a very popular slogan here, the drunkard's progress. You know, you start off shallow and low, and you start drinking. The more you drink, the more worthless you become. Okay. Again, the whole idea is trying to impose discipline on society. All right, then leads us to social reform. All right, and again, all this seems to be somewhat connected. With the social reform, they want to try to create a system where victims of society that are perceived to be turbulent and unstable could be rehabilitated. All right, and the first one being the prostitution, or the fallen woman. Sarah Ingram, she writes The Advocate of Moral Reform and helped create the Female Moral Reform Society that focused on the Johns, meaning the guys who pimp, who buy the prostitutes, and as well as focuses on the pimps themselves, and not necessarily the girls. But the idea is that they want to reduce the amount of women that are selling themselves for money. Okay. The seventh area is education reform. Here, the idea is they want to go from religious training or schools that are set up by churches to more of a secular education, meaning non-religious focused. In Massachusetts, they're the first state, and they're on the forefront of public education reform. The first state to establish the tax-supported local public schools. And by 1860, every state is going to offer some amount of free public education to whites. Understand, though, by 1860, America had the highest literacy rates because of this. All right. The leading figure within the education reform is Horace Mann, who is known as the father of American education. His idea is that children were clay in the hands of teachers and school officials. And I'm just molding you guys into being prosperous citizens and giving back. And that you guys, after you leave my class, will be in some state of perfection, you know. He really discourages corporal punishment. That's where we disagree. And what he does do, and which is still around today, is he establishes some form of state teacher training programs. Okay. And here are just some McGuffey electric readers. Readers are like textbooks, the vocabulary books that they used to use. And you see, they use religious parables to teach American values. You know, the story of David versus Goliath, and you know, things like that to teach you about the American values. And really, the group that was getting the most education were the middle class, and they wanted to teach that middle class morality and respect for order. And again, the keys to the education system were the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic, and this Protestant ethic, all right, meaning hard work, sobriety, frugality, things like that. Okay. Some famous women educators. You have Emma Willard. We talked about her sister Frances already, but Emma is going to be a part of this New York female seminary where they're going to teach math and physics and history and geography, and they're going to train female teachers. All right. You also have Mary Lyons, who's going to help establish Mount Holyoke, which is still around today, as the first college for women. Today, it's very expensive to go there. But what happens from the female education leads to this separate spheres concept. All right, there's some people who are against it. All right, and women in the 1830s and 40s had to deal with traditional limitations as well as new roles in the family that require them to focus energy on the home and the children. They leave income earning to the husbands. Men, you know, there was a resentment over this limitation, and therefore leaders of the women's movement, such as the Grimke sisters, the Stowe sisters, Lucretia Matt, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Dorothea Dix, etc., began to draw connections between their abolitionist ideas as well as the plight of women. All right. This cult of domesticity, this idea that a women's sphere was in the home. It was a refuge to protect them from the cruel world outside. And it was her job to civilize her husband and family. For example, in 1830s, Massachusetts minister said the power of woman is her dependence. A woman who gives up that dependence on man to become a reformer yields power God has given her for her protection, and her character becomes unnatural. Meaning, basically, women belong in the household, all right? And they go as far as coming up with all these scientific, or what we call pseudo-scientific platforms and brochures and pamphlets and such that, you know, preach about how women are incapable of being outside the home. You know, when they have their periods, that they go through a case of insanity, and that, you know, women who have children become so what's the word? I guess postpartum, that they don't know how to think well, and therefore they shouldn't be given too much to do. And, you know, it's really real sexist against women, and it's meant to keep women in the household and keep men working. All right. But understand, early century women were unable to vote, They had legal status as a minor. If they're single, they could own property, but once you're married, you had no control over your property or your children. You could not initiate divorce. Your husband could be cheating on you with 1,000 women, and you couldn't divorce him. All right, you couldn't sign wills. You couldn't make a contract. You couldn't even sue anybody in court without your husband's permission. If you came home or your husband came home and just felt like beating on you, you couldn't call the police. You couldn't have any type of protection because you were a piece of property, just as the slaves were. Okay? So what would it be like if ladies had their own way? And this is a very popular pamphlet to show and really scare men into keeping women in the household. And you see the men doing all the work in the house and the women going out for fun. Okay? But again, this cult of domesticity is connected with slavery, all right, and the anti-slavery movement. The Second Great Awakening is going to inspire women to improve society. So you have Southern abolitionists such as the Grimke sisters, all right. You're going to have Lucy Stone, who's going to create the American Suffrage Association, which is to encourage women's right to vote. All right, and so what happens is there becomes this split in women's rights. All right, in 1840, the abolition movement is going to split over women's role in it. The World Anti-Slavery Convention, led by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, are going to create what's called the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. All right, and we'll look at that later tomorrow. But the whole idea is that there's some women who want gradual emancipation of slaves and some that want immediate. And the ones that want immediate emancipation are the ones that are also strong women's rights leaders and demand more rights. Okay? But last but not least, for the reformers is the abolition movement. Obviously, it begins very early with the American colonization movement in 1816. Along with that, you're going to have a period in the 1820s and 30s that is going to call for the creation of a free slave state in Liberia and West Africa. But there's no real anti-slavery sentiment in the North. All right. What you have is this conflict over the abolition movement over gradualists versus immediates. There's some that, again, want gradual emancipation, some want immediate. And that's going to cause a lot of problems with the abolition movement. There's going to be a series of anti-slavery propaganda that's going to be used, such as this alphabet. And then, of course, you have William Lloyd Garrison, who is a slavery and masonry, thought slavery and masonry undermined Republican values. And what he does is he's going to create the Liberator, which is a abolitionist newspaper. Very, very influential in spreading the word of anti-slavery movement. All right, and he believed slavery was a moral, not an economic issue, whereas others thought it was an economic and not a moral issue. All right, and here's his Liberator. Again, very popular political cartoons where people are competing over the best way to address it. All right, some other white abolitionists: Louis Tappan, Arthur Tappan, James Burney, and they create the Libertarian Party. They have candidates in 1840 and 44. All right. You also have at this time black abolitionists, very important. David Walker. He writes The Appeal to Colored Citizens of the World, who really, he argues for this fight for freedom rather than waiting to be set free by whites. He was a former slave himself that will eventually go to London, become free, go to London, become educated, and write to other educated blacks in the world. Another very famous one, obviously you should already know, Frederick Douglass, who writes a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. He also writes a newspaper called the North Star. You have Sojourner Truth, all right, who is a runaway slave. And then Harriet Tubman, or Moses, as she's known in the Underground Railroad. Now, there's some discrepancy here. There's some accounts that say she helped over 300 slaves, and I've heard as many as 50 slaves. The true number we don't know. A lot of them, though, we know were her family members, and she's from Maryland. She's from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, so it's not really that far of an escape, but still very important because she will escape. She becomes a spy during the Civil War, and again helps many people escape through the Underground Railroad, and brings just attention to the issue of slavery. Okay, and these are just some terms known on the Underground Railroad. All right, that's the reform movement. Thank you.